Hello, welcome to another Diminishing Returns. This week we're coming up to Halloween, doing lots of spooky stuff, and there's a new Suspiria remake on the way, so we're looking at seminal, giallo, Italian horror thriller thing, Suspiria. With me as ever is Mr. Alan Turing.
Buongiorno.
Doing Italian there. and we're joined this week by Sophie Harris.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
No relation. Oh wait, yeah, it is.
another bit of nepotism. And Sophie, you've brought your violinist along, David.
Also a film scorer.
Hello.
Oh wait, we were supposed to bring our violinist along. No one told me. I could have.
Sorry, you can bring yours next week.
Oh god. All right.
But yeah, Suspiria it's a really interesting one. I'm glad we're looking at it. I'm glad this remake's come out to kind of give us the kick up the arse to do it. I think this might be, if not the most visually, aesthetically beautiful film I've ever seen, certainly like one of the top 5, but I hate it. And that's because I find it incredibly boring and the story doesn't work, and I wish I liked it more because I love how it looks and sounds.
Well,
Alan,
may I go next, because I'm going to back you up on most of that. Just to give a bit of background, I'm not particularly up on horror films. I'm not particularly big up on Italian cinema either. So Dario Argento is a bit of an unknown quantity to me. But obviously I'm aware of the film and its reputation, etc., etc. Never watched it before. So having just seen it, yeah, I will agree. I thought it was some very visually interesting cinematic stuff, but no effort to make any kind of sensible plot or interesting characters or proper actors. And that sort of thing does bother me. So just as a general thing there, I think I agree with you to a large extent.
Can I
offer a rebuttal?
Stuff?
Yeah.
Basically.
I'm hoping you guys are going to like it, because it's nice to have people who can stick up for the films when we both. Yeah.
I think that visually, aesthetically, like obviously it's amazing. I think that's what people are like mainly drawn to. I think on like a first watch, I was definitely a bit confused about how like kitsch it is. The characters are just super not padded out. They're very one-dimensional. But I think in like a lot of ways, that's kind of what makes it really good. I don't know. I'm really interested in like the 70s. They're interested in the occult. They're interested in like undermining stuff that's come before them to make a point about the world at the time. And I think that they really like undermine that like Disney-esque I think they use a lot of like primary colours, that fairy tale, like undermining of that. And I think it's like a critique on that in some ways.
That almost sounds, just before we started recording, I was talking about going to see Venom the other day and how much I loved it, even though it was shit, and how I kind of enjoyed how shit it was. That almost made it more enjoyable for me.
Yeah, it's like bizarre, And
it almost sounds like you're getting a similar thing out of it there, with like certainly with the characters being a bit thin and stuff. Would that be fair? I don't know.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of like you're,
I don't know. I think
embracing the camp of it almost.
Yeah, I think the difference is it was purposefully done.
So yeah, you're suggesting they made it shit as a subversive act.
Yeah.
Do you know what? Coming out of the film, I was trying to give as much benefit of the doubt as possible. I was thinking along those lines. But bear in mind, I have also watched Inferno and Mother of Tears by Dario Argento, and I'm not convinced.
I haven't watched those.
I'm not convinced it's, but I think he's just shit.
Well, I think Dario Argento, I think he's a remarkably talented guy in some respects. I've seen a few of his films, including these 3. Yeah, I don't know if he's got much in the way of story and characters in him, but I'd say he's one of the most visually interesting directors ever. And that's worth something. He's a real auteur.
I think that's worth a lot, personally. I think to go into a film like Suspiria and to start talking about plot is already kind of missing the point a little bit. In fact, I would argue that a film like Suspiria would be worse if it had more focus on plot, because it's not really a film to me that's about plot. And it's using a lot of tropes. It's deliberately using a lot of tropic visual filmic language. And it's using that as a kind of vehicle to give us these very, very kaleidoscopic and at times very, very experimental visual scenes. So I actually see Suspiria in a kind of a similar way to how I see a lot of David Lynch films, for instance, where you can't really go into something like Mulholland Drive and say the plot didn't make any sense because well, you can, but if you do that, you're sort of missing the point because if you went to a film like Mulholland Drive and said the plot made sense, I'm sure David Lynch would be very upset with you for saying that because he doesn't want a plot that makes sense. A plot that makes sense is sort of antithetical to what he's trying to do with the film, or to, what he's trying to give you as a kind of gift with the film. And I think Suspiria is a film that I see it as a gift. I really like it. It's visually nice, but it's more than that. I don't like the idea that you can kind of say it's deliberately bad, but I think it's deliberately exploiting a lot of tropes of horror films and tropes certainly of giallo films.
I mean, every Argento film I've seen has been cut from this cloth. Certainly what he's directed himself. And it's not just visually, it's the full on, it's the whole mise-en-scene aesthetic. It's the music, of course, is a huge part of it. It's all of it.
Well, this is, I think, partly my problem with it, and I do have a similar kind of problem with Lynch, actually, that the way I am focused, I'm really plot character driven, and we've talked about this on the show before, and that's obviously there's a big element of personal taste there, and so it does stop me from connecting with such things like this. And music, I never really connect with music very well, so this is good to have someone else with a completely different point of view, because I really struggle to connect with stuff like this, and I can appreciate it as a piece of art. But from a film point of view, I feel like there's something else that I want from it. Yeah. But fair enough, film covers a lot of different things, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you watch some of his stuff where he hasn't directed it, so, for example, he wrote, I think he produced as well, a couple of films called Demons, which are these really low-grade, like, shitty Italian horror films from the 80s. Again, there's some really incredible visual stuff in there, some really nice dreamlike stuff, but it ultimately is just a silly zombie movie where demon things come out of the cinema screen and attack people in a cinema. And
the preview you are about to watch is for a movie that is unlike any you have ever seen before. It is for a movie that goes beyond temporary fear to everlasting terror. It is a movie called Demons. Yes, the demons are coming, and they're coming for you. Warning, if you have the courage to see demons, sit near an exit. Otherwise, you might never get out.
It is absolute nonsense, and it's not trying to be anything more than that. Yeah. But it's interesting because I think that is Dario Argento with him taken out of the picture as the director, so you can kind of see, it is just trashy and exploitative. So he obviously is bringing a certain class to the proceedings when he's actually behind the camera himself. It
would be interesting to know, whether he means to have a point behind, is it intentional that the characters aren't padded through? Is it intentional that the plot doesn't make much sense? And from my perspective is that it is intentional. I think I read a lot of literature from that era as well, and I think that it was a big trend. That chaotic interest in occultism. Occultism itself is very chaotic. The dream, the unconscious, things about Freud you can bring in. There's so many things that you can talk about in relation to this film about the point that he's trying to make. But again, it's a question of whether that's intentional. You can say that about anything, really.
I don't think it even matters if it's intentional. If Dario Argento was trying to make a sophisticated, plot-driven, character-driven film and failed terribly, that doesn't really have any bearing on the film for me, because it being intentional or not, it doesn't matter. The fact is, it works for me the way that it is, regardless of if it was accidental, or if it was deliberate, or if it was intentional.
I
don't know about that. I think it would definitely affect the way I received it in its intent. in the same way that I can watch Tommy Wiseau's The Room, and what I get out of it is not necessarily what he intended, but a showing of his subconscious, and I can get something more out of that.
But you're bringing that. It's you that's bringing that expectation of what the author is trying to do. It is ultimately coming from you, because you can never really get anywhere close to understanding what another person is thinking or feeling or intending. To be honest, I don't even know if anyone can say for sure what they themselves are intending or feeling or doing deliberately or doing subconsciously or anything like that. So when you go into a film and you start talking about the director's intention, what you're really talking about is your own expectation of what you think their intention was.
I agree you can take things out that others wouldn't, but I think most people who are creating art have an intent and are putting that out. And the ultimate idea is that people will understand it. And some artists may deliberately obscure it even. But I think most people do set out with an intent and want that to be seen as the author's intent.
And for sure.
And I think it's it can massively improve or subtract from my reading of a film when I know what was intended. I've seen things like It Follows we discussed on this podcast a while back, and my big issue with the film was similar to this. It just didn't kind of hold up to any sort of coherency. It was just kind of all over the place. The rules of the film didn't make sense, and Alan defended it, saying it was dreamlike and a metaphor. But then I went and listened to the director talking about it, and he was talking about, I think the demon could get on a bus maybe, or, all these rules of it. And I don't know, it just really took away from this ethereal way of reading it that he was thinking about it in these terms. And
I don't know where Argento stands, but I think the fact that, he uses a lot of intertextual things, the whole thing is based on like Thomas de Quincey. It's very like highbrow. There's a lot of symbolism in it. He was very
I think this might be
influenced
part of my
by
problem
symbolist
with it.
people.
Is that I kind of came to Argento as, he's one of George A. Romero's mates, and he produced the Italian cut of Dawn of the Dead and brought Goblin in to do the soundtrack and everything. So I've kind of come to him through arguably lowbrow zombie movies. So, I make an argument for Dawn of the Dead as proper art, but I've seen a hell of a lot of Italian horror from the 70s and the 80s, but it is largely complete schlock. So not just schlock, but very much a product. Italian horror of the 70s and 80s particularly was real businessmen, opportunistic businessmen who were buying up films, making unofficial sequels to films, because of Italian law basically meant you could make a film called, Dawn of the Dead, for example, Zombie 2. It was released in Italy. It was released in Italy as Zombie, so a load of people made Zombie 2, Zombie 3, Zombie 4, nothing to do with the film, just to cash in on it.
Like the kitschness of this film, like, could be a comment on that in a way as well. I think that brings it down from being highbrow.
But if anyone hasn't seen Suspiria who's listening to this, what is the plot? It's kind of there's this boarding school of witches.
It's a ballet school, I think.
Well, I found ballet schools is already quite a culty sort of setting for a
And there's always film. Like a matriarchal figure there.
Exactly, yeah. Which really plays into these very kind of very, very old-fashioned ideas of suspicion around sort of matriarchal figures. It kind of, it really goes back a long way. And I guess just sort of coming back to the disappointment that you said you were feeling with this film, I actually kind of agree, because every time I watch the film, I always find the final confrontation of the film to be a kind of a red herring, or just kind of a false end. I always feel like the film is constantly building, constantly leading up to the reveal of what it is that's inside this labyrinth. And ultimately, it's kind of, you get this confrontation and then it's over in half a minute, and then the film ends. And I wanted to see more. I wanted to see more weird shit, I wanted to see just more of the maggots falling out of the ceiling, and just things that make absolutely no sense.
Yeah, it's a really odd finale as well, in that watching it again, it just kind of, it reminded me of a video game boss, because she ultimately defeats it by figuring out the timing and then stabbing it at the right exact moment, which is it's not like a character journey so much as a...
She even has that like white silhouette, like in some kind of video game, like flashing. It's like that,
and it's a nice little moment, I think. It's quite inventive, but it does just feel like, oh, that's kind of...
a bit too easy,
okay.
really, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not just the cinematography, though, the aesthetics. It goes right the way through the production design. I think the buildings, the art design, the locations are all incredible to look at. They're almost like M.C. Escher paintings.
Yeah.
I thought so as well. Yeah. The scene I think for me is the most like striking is when the blind man with his seeing eye dog attacks him, but he's in that incredible square that's like surrounded by like neoclassical buildings, and it really brings you back to like it's a very powerful place. Like it's very stark black and white. It's like really contrasting the red that's been like throughout the film. That was a really for me like significant part of the film in terms of aesthetic.
Oh no, absolutely. I've always, every time I've watched this film, I've kind of checked out by that scene, but then that scene always wakes me up and kind of grabs me, pulls me back into it.
Really makes you think about psychogeography, and it's basically like linking like the area that you're in to like the history of that area and making it inform the way you look at that area. And I think that those neoclassical buildings, like in Germany with this German shepherd, like you can't help but think about, you know, of Nazism and like, you know, that side
that
of
scene particularly,
the history of Germany.
Yeah, I would definitely say that scene's intentionally invoking Nazism for whatever reason. Because
I'm not really
I think
sure
it is just
why, but I think...
I get that though. Every time I've watched it, it's kind of made me think.
You know, dragging up the histories of you know, dragging up the occult history, it's like this uncanny like contrasting.
Well, that's
it
the point.
with
I
modern,
forgot the Nazis.
the modern,
yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing. Yeah.
I've made the note here. I think my best attempt to explain what giallo is, aesthetically speaking, I think it's just a lack of visual subtlety. I kind of love it for that. I realise I don't like... That's not fair, no. I do like subtlety, but I've got a real respect for things when they are just brash and over the top and willing to embrace that. And
well, the thing that I find about the lighting, especially, is that it's not only is it just primary colours, but it's also very, very explicitly theatrical.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It looks like a theatre stage. It doesn't look like a film stage. It looks like we're watching a play a lot of the time.
Especially when they're in bed, you know, after the maggots.
Yeah.
I really felt that.
And there's no attempt to hide the fact that there's a lamp behind this so that, you know, you can see where it's coming from, and they're not trying to hide it. And from that, it's almost like an invitation to sort of watch this as a piece of filmmaking, as opposed to necessarily get sort of immersed in the story or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it took me back to German Expressionism. It's a pretty obvious route there. But it is something that was largely lost.
I hadn't really thought about that. That's a really good shout, actually, thinking about it. Of course it is, yeah.
When sound cinema came in, there was a lot of metaphor in film lost, and it became much more realism. And I'm saying this as someone who really likes realism, so, you know, I can still appreciate silent movies for different reasons. And this really harks back to that for me. And I don't think that's an unconscious thing. That's obviously there.
Yeah, I think the main thing is distorting senses as well. I was definitely very aware of how loud things were. The soundtrack was extremely loud, so the quiet bits were extremely quiet.
But, I mean, there was a scene that really jumped out at me this time, that the first real overt horror moment in the film, I suppose, where, again, completely lacking in any subtlety, the woman looks out of the window and sees these animal eyes in the darkness, and then this hand just bursts from nothing, from the shadows, grabs her. It's this really quite horrific but nightmarish. It's not... I've seen a lot of slasher films, mostly thanks to my friend Calvin, who used to do this show. And I'm not a massive fan of the genre, but they either go for silly and campy comic slasher type stuff, or they go for just horrifically realistic gore, unpleasant stuff. And this was something that I haven't really seen before. It was that same kind of stuff, but done with that kind of, we're actually trying to make horror here. This is the kind of, imagery that's going to stay with you.
Yeah.
that might haunt you. You know, it's horrific with her having her face pushed up against the window and then sort of pushed through this glass, and it's a horribly hairy arm as well.
It really is, yeah. It's not a big shock film. Like, I don't feel like I don't jump or anything. I don't feel like it's shocking in like how gory it is, but I don't think that it's like shocking in the sense of like making you jump. And I think that's like purposefully done. I feel like it's like a slow peak.
Yeah, I forgot how gory it was as well, actually. I don't know, I kind of remember it being on par with those old Hammer horror films and that. You get a lot of bright red blood, but I don't know, I found it quite shocking when they, for example, ripped open that woman's rib cage and started stabbing her heart and all these sorts of things. And, you know, that's the sort of stuff you got in these Italian horror films from that era.
I was watching this, there's a lot of gore, but I wasn't thinking about, oh my God, that's gory, because there's a sort of unrealistic sense to it. Obviously, the bright colours and all that.
The blood is like not blood,
this felt to me like a deliberate subversion of gore, and like saying, okay, you want ridiculous gore, here's some ridiculous, in the kind of same way the Evil Dead does, for example, like that kind of ridiculousness of it.
The same's very true of Dawn of the Dead, which has ridiculous colours, and a lot of that is down to makeup not looking right on camera when they after they filmed it and stuff. But I know the bright, vibrant red blood was intentionally part of an attempt to make the film feel fantastical and like a comic book, was what George Romero always used to say, which I think is quite similar really to what this is, because, you know, that's the American giallo paperback. It's comic books. It's that kind of pulp, you know, cheap print media, isn't it? So I think they were kind of approaching these from the same sort of place, but just different cultural outlooks. All I've got left to talk about really is the music. Have you guys got anything else to say before we move on to that? Or
if we're going to talk about the music, can I just sort of throw my thing in, because I feel like I'm not going to have a lot to say about this. It's just not my area at all. So I'm going to say what I think, and then you can go ahead and tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So the soundtrack here is very overt, and I found it distracting at times. I found it overscored. I know it's deliberate, but I didn't particularly like it.
Yeah, I that is something I would say Goblin are quite guilty of in pretty much every film of theirs I've seen. And even Dawn of the Dead, where they've got, you know, an American sensibility calling the shots, there's some really full-on bits of music that just take you completely out of the film. And I do think that's intentional here. I don't know if it always is. I don't know if it ever was in Dawn of the Dead, but...
I think they made the soundtrack first, actually, like before
really?
the film. Yeah, and like I think that he would play it on set. I know that Argento brought in a synth and was like, we want to put this in. But he was like, you need to make this weirder. Like, you need to put and make it, I think, more modern. Because I think a lot of the film is obviously combining, like, the occult and, like, the old world with, like, really modern, like, Art Deco stuff. I don't think they really used synths in soundtracks then.
They
really?
did, but only in really cheesy sci-fi.
Yeah. And thinking about it, I mean, I love this sound that sort of late 70s, 80s horror movies had, which is very synth heavy for the most part.
What we really need to do is create a powerful sense of dread. See, the longer the note, the more dread.
And yeah, thinking about it, I think this is the earliest example of that I can really think of. Dawn of the Dead had loads of it, but that was the following year. Most examples that come to mind were the 80s. Yeah, I really like what they did here. I think the main theme is the most notable bit of music in the film, with the sort of in the background. But it's really creepy, and it is very overt, and again, it's so over the top that it kind of does take you out of the film whenever it kicks in, and you hear this person shouting "witch."
A lot of people actually draw like comparisons to Harry Potter. And like, and when you listen to it, it's
I never thought of that. That's a really good point.
Oh my god, they're really similar. I can't believe I hadn't They're really similar. That's yeah.
I think what makes this soundtrack for me really interesting is obviously by this point it was fairly common to have sort of bands doing film soundtracks, but in this case it's a soundtrack that's so eclectic. You know, if you didn't know it was done by a band, you wouldn't assume it was done by a band, because you've got Celeste, you've got a Greek bouzouki, you've got you've got the Moog synthesizer, you've got people running around whispering witch into my, you know. The music for Suspiria is very much for me a kind of the other side of the coin to the lighting, right? So the lighting is always obvious that it's a lamp stuck behind a chair or whatever. Like, you're never allowed to forget that the lighting is artificial, in the same way the music is the kind of sonic counterpart to that.
Yeah.
You're never allowed to forget that it's a soundtrack. You're never allowed to kind of... I mean, nowadays it's common to have this approach to film scoring where the score should be felt and not heard. It should be sort of subconsciously felt.
I've never quite agreed with that. I've always
I don't agree with that, and the reason why I love this soundtrack is because it's something that you can't just feel. It's something you have to hear. It's like the maggots are what they are because they sound the way they sound.
Yeah.
They sound like this weird fucking repetitious spiral of mania. You know, it just goes round and round and round and round and round.
Yeah, I mean, that's something Goblin do a lot of, actually, in their soundtracks, is they... And, I mean, it's not unique to them, but they do seem very good at creating bits of music for certain scenes that's actually quite unpleasant to listen to. It's not a particularly nice experience, but it works as a complement to that scene. It's proper film scoring, and that it's...
And in a way, that kind of goes all the way back to... Psycho. I mean, the music to Psycho is similarly repetitious and obsessive, and it's got this quality of just spiraling itself out of control.
Yeah.
But I think, especially with the use of synthesizers in Suspiria, I kind of can't help but feel like a lot of what we get from John Carpenter, you know, a few years later is not...
Well, I was just about to say, I found it really interesting that you guys have pointed out that this was kind of a pioneering film musically. I'd never really thought about it that way, but I guess it was. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like this and John Carpenter kind of set the tone for horror movie music for the next, 20, 30 years, really. I think I can't think of many other influences on the genres, what you think of when you think of horror music.
When was this in relation to, say, The Exorcist or The Omen, something like that?
Yeah, I think it was quite early 70s, The Exorcist. I always forget about The Exorcist as an early nubbin of that kind of extreme horror.
I mean, The Exorcist is not really a film where the soundtrack exists kind of separately from the film in a lot of ways. Whereas with
it's a main
Suspiria,
theme, really,
you can't hear the maggots music without seeing the maggots. It's a lot more kind of multi-sensory in that way.
Yeah. And The Omen's just a completely different thing musically. I mean, it's great, and it's had a huge, huge influence on a very specific subgenre of horror. Mother of Tears, the third one of these films, even took a lot of influence from it musically, but it's kind of its own thing, I'd say. Alan, what do you give this one out of 10?
Well, it's been really interesting listening
You're going to be really harsh.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's been very interesting listening to you guys talk about this, and this is definitely not my taste in film, and that affects my judgment of it, obviously. But at the same time, I do appreciate some of the elements here. I gave it a 6 out of 10.
Oh, wow.
Which, considering what I like in films, is quite a good score, I think. Because everything that I like in films is not in this.
That's a very positive score from you. Particularly as I'm only giving it a 5. So I've been singing a lot of its praises, but I just get bored when I watch it. As much as I love aspects of it, I would rate certain scenes like 9, 10 out of 10, but as a coherent whole, it doesn't. But I feel bad giving it a 5, so I'm hoping you two will be able to up the score. What would you give it?
David,
Sophie?
you gave it.
Or David?
I'd probably give it Just because of the final confrontation, which I always find disappointing, I'm going to give it a 7.
Okay,
fair enough.
But I would otherwise be 8. I think.
I think I'm gonna go with a 7.5.
We don't do halves. It's a thing. Really?
Am I not allowed?
No.
Oh, you can if you want. I say round it up to an 8. Pull the score up a little bit.
Yeah, 7.56.
No, don't, because this is going to open the door to Soul to just do 7s for everything.
Okay.
7.77.
Personally, yeah, it's actually, I really like this kind of film. I really like films that have a really not obvious meaning. I really like interpreting things. I really like analyzing things. So I feel like, yeah, it's a good film for me. I really like it.
That's cool. That's quite a polarizing, one of the most polarizing like set of scores we've had, I think, on here. Cool. So that's quite interesting. But yeah, I didn't know until very, very recently that they made sequels to this film. I always thought it was a standalone thing. But no, apparently it was a surprisingly successful film for, I think, 20th Century Fox when they released it in the States. And they were quite keen to get another one going. So 3 years later, we got Inferno.
I've never seen the next film, so I've not seen any of the sequels, so I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I only saw them for the first time yesterday.
Yeah, me too.
Mad scramble to watch them in time for this. Yeah, I had no idea they existed until a few weeks ago. And when I read about them, I thought, oh, they must just be like spiritual sequels. But no, they're like set in the same continuity. The third one refers back to characters and so on. So Inferno, well, it's in English for a start. It's far more American from the get-go. And it feels bizarrely different from the get-go. Kind of as it got going, I kind of began to warm to it. It began to feel more cut from the same cloth, but I found it very jarring initially.
There's something about the sets that were it was more unreal, but not in a kind of subversive, surreal way, just in a kind of cheap
it just
way.
Felt cheap.
Yeah. Like, oh, we've built this corridor here, we've built it. And the lighting, whereas in the first film, it's like all this evocative light, well, as we were talking about. In this film, it's like, look, we need a fill light on this back wall. Shall we make it red? Yeah. It felt a bit more like that. It just felt less thought through. It felt like someone who'd seen Suspiria and said, look, we need a sequel to this. Can you do this? Yeah, I can do that. With no thought behind it. Yeah. And that kind of made me feel like, oh, Suspiria did have more thought behind it because that worked. Or was that just an accident? I don't know.
I had a really weird thing because I basically went into it thinking, yeah, this just feels horrible and cheap, and like everything that made Suspiria work is kind of done badly here and not working. But then, like I say, as it went on, it started to come together for me a bit. I thought there was some really nice cinematography and some really lovely lighting and colours after a while, and the music, which isn't Goblin this time, it's a prog rock guy, Keith Emerson, I think he's called.
Oh no, yeah, I mean, he loves him. I think that's why he brought the synth in the first film. Loves prog rock.
The parts of the score of this film, and there was a couple of scenes in particular that jumped out at me where it felt like you know when they made silent movies and they'd have an accompanist pianist playing music?
Yeah.
Like, very rarely was that especially made for the film. It was just like, okay, I've got a book of music here. Where's the suspense music? This is the danger music. And there was a couple of bits like that just felt generic music I've chucked on the top of here. Not all of it. Some of it was better than that.
Well, that was it. At the start, it felt really overscored and just like boring, cheap piano stuff. But then, as it went on, you started getting all this like real prog rock stuff and these electric guitars kicking in, and I don't know.
There's certain scenes. There's a scene near the beginning where this woman basically goes underwater and she's looking for something and then ends up discovering all sorts of stuff. And it was like, I was really trying to like the scene because it was like, this is cool. She's kind of going into this underwater world. All this underwater footage was really nice.
Yeah, that was bizarre, yeah.
The water's kind of milky and murky, and her movements was really cool. And it just never did anything. And then all it is like, oh, there's a dead body, oh, scary. And it's like, it just felt like there was so much more there to be. Like it was like a glimpse of something that could have been really interesting, and it never quite got there.
I think the first point when I really started to come round on this film was it might be the first murder sequence.
Yeah.
It's a really fantastic scene. The fuse go, or like the lights and the music cut out in the flat, and these two characters are thinking, "Oh, what is that?" And the guy's like, "Oh, it'll just be the fuses. I'll go, flip the circuit board." And then they go out, and you hear this crash, and then she goes into the room and sort of calls out, what's going on? Are you all right? And then he just lunges out of the doorway with a knife through his neck and like blood spurting out, and he's like falling on top of her, covering her in blood. She's screaming, and it's really like it's that same kind of visceral energy that you got in Suspiria. I think it's done really well, and it's quite an effective, as far as that kind of slasher horror goes, I think it's quite an effective scene. And it made me realise, as much as I hate to say it, I really kind of got into that horror movie, slasher movie mentality watching this, where I was so bored when people were talking and in between the killings, but then every time someone got killed, the film just came alive, and it was vibrant and exciting, and it's like a really arty-farty take on a slasher movie. I wasn't just sat there going like, "Oh yeah, brilliant, they're gonna stab her eyes out, amazing." But then, having said that, there's some stuff in this film. There's a scene I can only describe as a woman being bombarded with cats, which made me laugh out loud.
It's just like, okay, throw the cats. We've got 7 grips here with cats.
You know how in in the classic horror thing of we need a cat to jump out and startle someone, and they just throw it at her. It's that done, but there's about 15 cats, and she's on the floor screaming, and they're just throwing the cats.
Like, they obviously didn't have enough
cats
cat. Because they keep cutting so that they've obviously picked the cats back up so they can do it again. And then there's like a close-up of a cat's face, like screaming. It's like the birds, when she's getting attacked by birds.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even like, are those cats the killer's minion, or... Because the cats don't kill her ultimately.
Oh, it's not explained.
It's just the cats.
And then a guy
and then
tries to kill some cats and gets eaten by rats.
Oh, that was great.
That's
too.
about 10 minutes of a man being eaten by rats. The protagonist of this film switched about 3 times. It kind of starts with one person, and then it goes to her brother or something, and then like to someone else. It was it was not easy to keep track of what was happening.
No. I don't know, for me, I really wasn't enjoying it to begin with, and it kind of started to win me round. It was almost the opposite of Suspiria, where I went into it thinking, this is amazing. And I ultimately kind of ended up at the same sort of place as I did with Suspiria, where I think there's a lot to like in this film. It's definitely not as good as Suspiria, but it definitely has a lot of the same qualities, and I don't really have much else to say about it, do you?
I didn't like it, and then didn't come to the point where you did, where you found something good in it. So,
What would you give that one out of 10 then?
I give it 2 out of 10.
Ooh!
Wow.
See, I give this one a 5 again. Not quite as strong a 5, but...
That's bizarre.
I think this one did kind of kill the franchise as it was for 20 years. Or yeah, Mother of Tears finally got put together and released in 2007. Just inherently incredibly different tonally through the fact that it's, shot digitally and that sort of thing.
This is like the plotting of Suspiria with no attempt whatsoever to make it visually engaging, or even on an aesthetic level, never mind a metaphorical level.
The giallo aesthetic is just out the window. There's the music's not remotely interesting until you get to there's kind of an attempt to make some interesting music with the theme tune at the end, but that just felt like
I assume, is the subject still about witches and...
Yeah, it's the third mother. It's the Mother of Tears in Rome. The third one is Mother of Tears is a bit different in that the final mother has amassed all these followers, like these witch followers, and they're all descending upon Rome, and
they're all like basically imagine like a 58-year-old man's idea of what a punk is.
No.
And then And then, like, I mean, it's just think, oh, this is a joke. It's taking this. It's got
and their plot is they do a load of occult sex games type stuff to somehow possess everyone in Rome in a way that's very loosely defined, but means that some people are just kind of randomly attacking other people, but others
Suicides.
are unaffected. So the first thing you see is a mother pushing her baby in a pram along a bridge, and then she just picks the baby up and throws it off the bridge. And it's unintentionally really funny because of the way it cuts to a plastic baby that kind of bashes its head on the side of the bridge, and then she starts weeping, and it's just not done very well at all.
But this is the one that made me think, maybe Dario Argento doesn't know what he's doing. Because
I think this is probably a classic example of a filmmaker not quite realizing why the thing they've made is good. And I don't think that Dario Argento is actually responsible for quite a lot of the stuff that is brilliant about Suspiria. I mean, he is surrounded by artists that he is employed because he trusts them as artists to have their own sensibilities. And a film is always a product of a huge team of very, very highly trusted people. But in 2007, Dario Argento is this name. No one wants to say, Dario Argento, I think your idea is stupid.
Yeah.
Because he's this kind of godlike figure.
It does feel like, the early time was like a young artist who wasn't bound by the rules and perhaps didn't even know the rules. Whereas now it's like, oh, I've learned how to make a film now, so that's how I'll do it. With no thoughts of it.
Yeah, and I mean, again, to draw the comparison to George A. Romero, it's that exact same thing. It's a horror icon of the 60s, 70s, 80s. Yeah. Then they are able to go out and make these low budget films with modern technology, but it just feels horrible and cheap. And there's something. The acting in this film is some of the worst acting I have ever seen in a film ever, in terms of like across the board, the cast. And I mean, I've seen the odd other thing with Asia Argento. I know she's capable of better. I don't know if I've ever seen her give a remarkable performance, but I've seen her give a competent performance before, and this was just awful.
There's also, I think that whoever funded it, there must have been a discussion like, look, we need to sell this to a certain demographic.
Put a monkey in it.
We need tits. We need some killings. There's definitely a softcore porn element to it.
Well, that's the other thing. The gore in this film is really like amped up from the other two, and it's done without any of that poetic artistry.
When did this come out?
2007.
Okay, so
this is what I imagine Charmed is like, but with more killings. I've never seen Charmed, but this is basically what I think of it. This felt like a crap TV show.
Yeah, what on earth were those presentations of women as well? I just can't.
Yeah, one thing I will say in this film's defense, one positive is that It really amps the scope of the story up. It really feels like they thought, this is the finale, this is the third part. The other two are kind of the same plot. Let's not do the same thing a third time. Let's do a big finale. The entire city's come down with witch possession because of this, evil mother. Now, there's an argument that they couldn't even begin to portray what they wanted to in the film, and it feels very cheap and small as a result, and they perhaps should have reined it in a bit and made a smaller film that might have worked on the budget, but they had an ambitious scope. I'll give them that.
What would you rate it, Saul?
So this one for me is a 2 out of 10, and I don't go that low lightly. That is damning from me.
I think that's very generous. I gave it a 1.
Ooh.
Wow. There's no redeeming features to this film whatsoever.
So the trilogy went out with a whimper, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, there's a remake being made, is basically ready to come out. Yeah,
I think it is out in some territories. Yeah, I mean that's what we're tying this episode in with. There's a remake of Suspiria imminent.
I mean, I don't know anything about it really, apart from the cast. But it is one of those things where if you tidy up the plot, there's a linear plot to be found there. I think that could be there, but if you're going to remake Suspiria, do you try and do something experimental and visual with it, or do you just try and make something completely, more mainstream perhaps, but new and make it work?
Well, I was really excited because I was hoping it was going to be that kind of aesthetic, but with the plot tidied up a bit. But from the sounds of it, it isn't. From the sounds of it, it's quite polarizing reading reviews. It seems to be that it's very visually, musically focused, but not concerned with plot like the original. I mean, I am interested in seeing it. I wrote it off as just, like, what's the point? We don't need a remake of that. And then I watched the trailer and I thought, oh no, this has been made by like a real artist. This is clearly like a lot higher end than I was expecting.
Well, it's directed by the guy who made Call Me by Your Name, which is a very intense character study, and that sort of gives me a bit of hope.
The thing about Suspiria is that if you're just going to make a straightforward horror film, there are better stories out there. Yeah. There's no this is not a good one. If you want a story to build a horror film out of, this is not the one to do. The only reason why you'd remake Suspiria is to work with the filmic language that you're being offered by Suspiria. And from the trailer, it looks like it's going to do that.
I'm watching the trailer right now, actually, as we speak. And obviously I've got no sound, so I'm just going on visuals. It looks visually quite nice, actually. I don't know if it's set in the 70s, but it looks deliberately like a 70s look.
It is. I think it's supposed to be.
The clothes look 70s. But also it looks like they're going to do stuff, they're going to make more of the dancing, like there's going to be some choreographed elements that could be nice. Just judging by the visuals of the trailer, there's some nice looking stuff in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing that really worries me is that it's 2.5 hours long.
Oof.
And that suggests that they are going to add a lot of new
there must be more plot
fleshing out of stuff into it. But I don't know, that's a long running time for a aesthetic experience that I don't know.
Oh, music by Tom York.
Well,
that's promising, but it should have been Johnny Greenwood, really. Like, to be honest.
I can see that, but I don't know. I think the stuff that's been released sounds amazing.
I haven't actually listened to any of it yet. I've kind of been holding off until I see it.
I mean, the stuff that's been released is not as intense as the Goblin soundtrack for sure. I think that it's piano-based, the thing I heard.
Right.
It's quite repetitive again. Yeah, I think it's very Tom York, though.
Okay.
I mean, there are vocals in it, so... And it's not just like witch, it's like proper, it's proper singing, so I think it's going to add a really different feel to the film.
Yeah.
I think we're really going to see how important the soundtrack is.
Yeah. It strikes me as an odd decision to remake this film, because if what you want to get out of it is really striking, intense visuals and, a really cool soundtrack, just make a new film.
Yeah, just make a new one.
You could even do, it's a school of witches, and I think that's a broad enough, or not school, it's a ballet school and there's a witch. I think that's a broad enough concept that you could just say, I've definitely taken some influence from Suspiria, but it's its own thing.
But it's obvious that the title Suspiria is going to draw in money, so that's obviously why.
So, okay, if you guys were given a chance to make a remake of Suspiria, how would you do it?
Or a sequel.
Sequel, yeah. But I think you're so far removed from it now. Yeah, it is like the remake is the obvious choice, but what would you do now that you could do something different? Like, what would you bring to it?
I think I definitely draw in on like the folk horror aspect.
Yes, yeah.
Like arriving in a place where someone feels detached from it, and you could relate it to like modern issues of immigration and stuff, and the issues that people are feeling being displaced.
The immigrant thing is interesting. Yeah, that sense of displacement. And if you had someone going into a different culture, and then you can kind of use that culture's history in terms of like whatever their boogeyman is. Every different culture's got their own little horror history. Folklore.
Exactly, folklore, yeah. Folklore seems to be quite, related to the nationalistic, which is quite scary sometimes. And I think that there are a lot of, negative ways that folklore can be used in order to like promote a country. And I think drawing in of like, the horrors of that would be interesting.
I think there's also something in the film about the loss of trust in authority figures, or rather the implicit trust in authority figures that's kind of abused. Mm-hmm. And that's an element which which is in the film but is not really explored. If
Yeah,
I were to remake the film, I'd kind of make much more of an emphasis on the fact that these authority figures are the people that are supposed to be responsible and are supposed to be the ones to go to for help, and they're the ones that actually are the people we need to run away from.
I've just remembered something that I read in the original idea for the story was that they were children. They were like 11 or 12 or whatever, and it was just impractical to do it that way.
Yeah.
But I think that plays much more into the authority figures, because when you're a child, that teacher is an authority figure, and so perhaps making them doing it as younger students. Plus, there's a great historical tradition of like 13-year-old girls being haunted or possessed or whatever. This might be a bit too on the nose, but you could do, especially if you're updating it, you could have a building that's full of cameras, CCTV everywhere. Mm-hmm. Use that as a visual idea in terms of showing security camera footage or whatever.
Like a panopticon or something,
And that's kind of been done, I suppose. But if you really made a feature of it, and it's not the most subtle metaphor for, Big Brother is watching, but...
Paranoia. Modern paranoia,
I think if I were remaking the film, one other thing that I would really want to toy with is the idea of the building itself as evil, or as
a character,
as something that is an enemy. And I think the only other film that I think that has done this sort of in a way that I think is masterful enough is
Monster House.
Shining.
Yeah, so you said The Shining there, didn't you?
Shining, yeah. So I kind of like one thing I think I'm missing in Suspiria is more of the idea that the buildings and themselves are not to be trusted. That because she kind of counts the footsteps and stuff, and she puts a lot of emphasis on that being implicitly true, or that implicitly kind of helpful. But what if you count the footsteps, but each time you go around the building, it's a different shape? Then obviously, you kind of find
got
yourself...
that feeling anyway. I kind of got
a little
that
bit
feeling.
Yeah, there are like secret passages and things. Not necessarily giving the house a sense of character is probably wrong, but making it more disorientating. And then,
What I would do if I was doing this remake is I would
get Rob Zombie to direct it.
I would attempt the crossover sequels are a big thing. I would attempt the world's first crossover remake, whereby you remake. let's go with Friday the 13th.
Oh no!
With the aesthetic sensibilities of Suspiria, and let's make that utter trash into something with a bit of artistic merit.
Actually, that would be quite good.
Yeah, hire an amazing cinematographer and just really play up the dreamlike qualities of it. Yeah, you get someone like Johnny Greenwood or Tom York in to do the music, and just get really talented people to remake Friday the 13th.
Thanks for listening, and if you're a fan of cult horror films, then make sure you join us next week for our official Halloween episode, completing our spooky October lineup as we look at the Reanimator franchise. In the meantime, please do go and visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/Diminishing Returns Podcast, where you can get bonus material, such as, this week, Sol and I went to see Venom, and we've done a little mini episode reviewing it. And you won't get that on our normal podcast feed, so you have to go to the Facebook page, or you can go to our website, dimreturns.com. So do go and check all that out. See you next week!